In 1978, the Palestinian-American professor Edward Wadie Saïd published Orientalism, in which he studied the West's conception of the Orient World and criticized modern imperialism. Right from the introduction, Edward Saïd highlights the two meanings of Orientalism. First, an Orientalist is anyone who teaches or researches the Orient. Second, Orientalism is a style of thought, an epistemological historical distinction between the Orient and the Occident. This distinction is built on a relationship of power that has been studied by Orientalists since Napoleon's entry into Egypt. Edward Saïd's Orientalism is an intellectual work that deconstructs the whole paradigm of Orientalism. By reflecting on his background as an Orient, born in Palestine and growing up in Egypt, Saïd considers that his education in these countries before moving to the United States has been Western, and yet his awareness of his Oriental origins has persisted. Edward Saïd begins his analysis of Orientalism by considering the representation that forms the Occident about the Orient since the British colonialism of Egypt. In the last reports of the British colonial administrator Lord Cromer, Egyptians were described as irrational, exotic, sly, suspicious, everything that is opposed to the clear, smart, and noble English race. This cultural strength, represented by the Occident, is structured through techniques and methods of writings. Henry Kissinger divides the contemporary world into two halves: developed countries, represented by the West, that is deeply committed to the notion of the real world being external to the observer, and developing countries that never went through the process of discovering empirical reality because they never had a Newtonian revolution. This separation imagined by the Western mind was deeply motivated by the religion of Islam that symbolizes for this part of the world terror, devastation, and hatred. Islam was a lasting trauma for the West, triggered after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, when Islam became a powerful force that conquered Spain, Sicily, and part of France. For Edward Saïd, the Orient is a West creation. In other words, the Orient was Orientalized. That is to say, the Orient does not exist objectively. It is made by the mind, and it is therefore a fictional reality. Saïd illustrates this conclusion by the metaphor of a group of people living on a few acres of land and decide to set up boundaries between their land and its immediate surroundings and the territory beyond, which they call the land of the barbarians. This imaginative geographical distinction does not require the acknowledgement of the so-called barbarians. This is how the relationship between Western writing and Oriental silence was constructed. As Edward Saïd put it, they become they accordingly, and both their territory and their mentality are designated as different from ours. Orientalism as a paradigm, a school of thought, was constructed through a long series of European encounters, first launched by Napoleon in Egypt. The Orientalist special expertise was put directly to functional colonial use. Artistic or textual works, such as the ones produced by Weil, Dozy, Burnouf, Stenthal, Humboldt, to mention a few famous names, were not the only products of Napoleonic expedition. In addition to that, they were more influential scientific projects whose chief instance is Ernest Renan's Système comparé et histoire générale des langues sémitiques. The Orient needed to be studied, to be known, in order to be recreated by scholars, soldiers, and judges. The purpose is to rule the modern Orient. The modern Orientalist theory and praxis are more of a set of structures inherited from the past than a sudden access to objective knowledge about the Orient. Although Orientalism shifted from a Christian basis to a secular one represented by philology, its paradigm was not fully deconstructed. Renaissance historians judged the Orient inflexibility as an enemy, like it was shown in the work of Edward Gibbon, who could read the lessons of Rome's decline and the rise of Islam. Historians of the 18th century confronted the Orient's peculiarities with some detachment and with some attempt at dealing directly with the Oriental source material. The cultural strength of the West transformed the Orient to an object that cannot be known without the mediation of the Orientalists. Antoine Isaac Silvester's De Saïd's ontologies refer to the Orient as something belonging to European scholarship. The Orient had to be recreated by the Orientalists according to Saïd's fundamental epistemological rules. In Edward William Lane's work, for instance, we notice this obsession with making Egyptians totally visible and without any sense of depth to the Western reader. Muslims are described as submissive to libidinous passions as opposed to Europeans who can control their passions and excitements. Another angle through which the Orient was orientalized is the search for exotic reality. Unlike Napoleon, the 19th century French pilgrims were seeking a sexual promise, entire sensuality, unlimited desire, deep generative energies. Gustave Flaubert found in the Oriental woman an occasion and opportunity for his musing. Her emotional carelessness and self-sufficiency allowed him to enter the process of reflection and thought. In Dictionnaire des idées reçues, Flaubert rose the epistemological challenge of describing the exotic and the strange of the Orient, formulated into lexicons, codes, and finally cliché. In the same perception of modern Orientalism seeking a new paradigm, Richard Francis Burton viewed the Orient in general, and Islam in particular, as systems of information, behavior, and belief, which made them a subject to history, geography, and the development of society. Burton's involvement and dedication to fully penetrate the Orient motivated him to learn to speak flawlessly the language and to live as an Oriental disguised as an Indian Muslim doctor. Such advanced techniques of philology and anthropology do not change the essence of Orientalism, which consists of seeking a systemic accumulation of human beings and territories, far from being exclusively an intellectual and theoretical feature. Therefore, Orientalism has always been an aspect of both imperialism and colonialism. The decolonization of the Orient following World War II transformed Orientalism techniques of domination. Orientalism now, or Manifest Orientalism, is more about commercial geography, policymakers, and imperial agents than scientific discoveries, literature, and arts. This transformation does not change the latent Orientalism formulated in the 18th and 19th centuries, but manifested by being more involved in the Orientals' lives as well as the remain of the distinction between the East and the West. Edward Saïd writes, "There are grants and other rewards. There are organizations, there are hierarchies, there are institutes, centers, faculties, departments, all devoted to legitimizing and maintaining the authority of a handful of basically in changing ideas about Islam, the Orient, and the Arabs." In this transformation of Orientalism, we may notice that some scholars of the 20th century seem more liberal in their position about the Orient. Louis Massignon, for instance, is known for his support of Palestinian refugees. However, his bias and prejudice about Islam and the Orientals remain. Some of these stereotypes view Arabs as camel-riding nomads, incompetent and easy defeated people, anti-Zionists or oil suppliers. In newsreels or news photos, the Arab is always shown in large numbers, no individuality, no personal characteristics or experiences. Most of the pictures represent mass rage and misery or irrational gestures. Lurking behind all these images is the menace of jihad. All this propaganda generates a fear that the Muslims or Arabs will take over the world. One of the most serious critics exploited in the work of the 20th century Orientalists is by the Moroccan historian and political theorist Abdullah Al-Arawi. Al-Arawi undertakes an important critical analysis of Gustav von Grunbaum's views on Islam. According to von Grunbaum, modern Islam has turned away from the West because it remains faithful to its original sense of itself. And yet Islam can modernize itself only by a self-reinterpretation from a Western point of view, which of course von Grunbaum shows is impossible. Al-Arawi's analysis demonstrates that von Grunbaum mobilizes a cultural approach to understand Islam represented as a closed system of exclusions. For von Grunbaum, Islam culture is a direct reflection of an invariant matrix, a particular theory of God that compels them all into meaning and order. Development, history, tradition, reality in Islam are therefore interchangeable. Al-Arawi maintains that history as a complex order of events, temporalities, and meaning cannot be reduced to such a notion of culture, in the same way that culture cannot be reduced to ideology, nor ideology to theology. In this regard, Edward Saïd Saïd highlights how von Grunbaum has fallen both to the Orientalist dogmas he inherited and to a particular feature of Islam, which is finding in Islam a highly articulated theory of religion and yet very few accounts of religious experience, a highly articulate political theory and few precise political documents, a theory of social structure and very few individualized actions, a theory of history and very few dated events, an articulated theory of economics and very few quantified series, and so on. In the end, Orientalism continues to be associated with its biblical background as well as its Islamophobia. Orientalism's structure never changed its basics, which maintains the division between the West and the East and all the conflict and hostility it carries. This book had received several critics that can be summed up as being an anti-West ideology or a supporter of Muslim fundamentalism. The answer of Edward Saïd to these claims is that the development and maintenance of every culture and identity require the existence of a different or competing alter ego. Saïd claims that his main goal is to free scholars from an erroneous Orientalism paradigm that had constructed the imagination of several generations. Saïd's work contributed to the development of postcolonial studies. This critical academic school of thought focuses on the impact of colonialism and imperialism on colonized people and their lands.